We established that the biblical flood was a global event. Now let's cover the post-flood, the aftermath of the flood. Main points. 1. What key events happened post-flood that can still prove a global flood? And 2. Can the events of the post-flood tell us the age of the earth? For topic number 1, we're going to touch on 2 important points. 1 is Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, and 2 is the Ice Age. Let's begin with Walt Brown explaining what the hydroplate theory is and why it proves a global flood. Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit educational or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
Could it be that hidden within this simple description, the answers to the skeptic's most difficult questions may be found? Having served as director of one of the United States Defense Department's major research and development laboratories, Dr. Walter Brown comes with an impressive list of credentials and credibility. In tackling the subject of Earth's geological development, Dr. Brown has developed a theory that contradicts the generally accepted viewpoint of the scientific community. Profound and far-reaching, this respected scientist's hydroplate theory not only offers a completely new approach to the geological sciences, it succeeds where the prevailing theory often fails. It simply and logically explains some of the Earth's most profound mysteries.
We can see on our planet 25 major features that can now be systematically explained as a consequence of a global flood that erupted from subterranean chambers with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 30 trillion hydrogen bombs. This theory shows us just how rapidly major mountains form. It explains the coal, oil, and methane deposits, the rapid continental drift, and why on the ocean floor there are huge trenches, hundreds of canyons, and tens of thousands of volcanoes. This theory also explains the ice ages, and it gives the primary reason for global warming. It explains the formation of the layered strata in almost all fossils, the frozen mammoths, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. Surprisingly, it explains the origin of comets, of asteroids, and of meteorites.
According to Dr. Brown's theory, the ancient world that Noah lived in was very different from the Earth we occupy today.
Noah and other pre-flood people probably lived on one very large supercontinent with lush vegetation, inland seas, and major rivers. The mountains were smaller than today's, perhaps 6,000 feet high. Before the flood, about half the Earth's water was in interconnected chambers about 10 miles below the Earth's surface. This formed a thin spherical shell almost a mile thick. The pressure in the subterranean chamber had been increasing for centuries because the gravity of the sun and moon produced tides in the subterranean water that lifted and lowered the Earth's massive crust twice a day. This tidal pumping added gigantic amounts of energy to the subterranean water. This increasing pressure in the subterranean water steadily stretched the crust as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began as a microscopic crack that grew in both directions at almost 3 miles per second. The crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched claw. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. The Bible even gives us a precise date, the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open. Then it says, and the rain fell. The fountains of water jetted supersonically into and above the atmosphere. The spray from these enormous fountains produced torrential rain such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The supersonic fountains eroded the crumbling rock on both sides of the widening crack. This produced huge volumes of sediments that settled through the floodwaters, trapping and burying plants and animals, forming the fossil record. Eventually, the crack became so wide that the newly exposed floor of the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, with lubricating water still beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of approximately 40 to 50 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, and like a runaway crashing train, they compressed, crushed, buckled, and thickened, rising out of the floodwaters. This is why the major mountains are generally parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. Today's major mountains were all pushed up in hours. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the mid-Atlantic ridge, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated.
This theory of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity appears to support the biblical story of the deluge in every detail. But what other evidence exists to support this amazing theory?
In 1970, I predicted that large pools of salt water would be found beneath major mountains. That prediction has been confirmed in several ways, by gravity studies, by seismic studies, and by electromagnetic studies.
A paper published in the April 2001 issue of Science magazine announced the discovery of an electrically conductive layer under the Tibetan Plateau. The article suggested that such high conductivity at depths of approximately 10 miles could be achieved by a layer of aqueous fluids, some 1.6 kilometers thick and containing 10% brine. In other words, salt water.
Just how big these subterranean layers of water will turn out to be, no one really knows. But the article points out that the conductivity is evident across the entire Tibetan Plateau.
Recently, even more evidence to support Dr. Brown's theory became available. On March 22, 1998, a group of boys playing basketball in Monahans, Texas, narrowly missed being struck by a 3-pound meteorite that crashed to the ground 40 feet from where they were playing. The police were notified, and 48 hours later, NASA scientists cracked the meteorite open in a cleanroom laboratory. What they discovered inside stunned them all. The meteorites contained salt crystals and liquid water.
The NASA scientists who investigated this meteorite believe it came from an asteroid. That's unlikely, because asteroids in the vacuum of space cannot sustain liquid water, which is required to form salt crystals. It's also too cold, and there's too little gravity. Earth is the only body in the solar system that can sustain liquid water on its surface. This demonstrates the enormous power of the subterranean supercritical water, the fountains of the great deep that launch water and rock fragments into orbit around the sun. These rock fragments are still returning to the Earth as meteorites. Meteorites contain Earth-like material, including many types of living but dormant bacteria. This means that meteorites and their bacteria didn't originate in the vacuum of space. Meteorites are literally tiny chunks of the Earth itself returning home.
Scientists are also scratching their heads over another recent discovery. On the Kola Peninsula in northern Russia, they have created the world's deepest hole, extending to a depth of 7.5 miles. At this depth, what they expected to find was a layer of basalt, Earth's most common type of volcanic rock. What they actually discovered was something entirely different.
The hole didn't reach the basalt underlying the granite continents, but to everyone's surprise, they did reach hot, salty water flowing through crushed granite. Geologists are mystified, but the hydroplate theory provides a simple explanation.
Did the springs of the Great Deep burst forth and flood the entire Earth, just as the Bible says? Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory offers us a plausible scientific explanation for how this may have happened. But is there something more important to this theory? Could it be yet another example of the supernatural engineering observed throughout the Bible? If we now know where the water of the Great Flood came from, the same water that was instrumental in forming the fossil record, then when the Great Flood receded, where did all the water go? The answer to that question not only bolsters the scientific theory that a worldwide flood actually took place, it also provides an alternative explanation for the formation of one of the world's greatest natural wonders.
This is the question that stops most scientific investigators dead in their tracks. Yet the hydroplate theory makes the answer obvious. As the hydroplates crashed, they thickened and rose out of the water, forcing the floodwaters over the continents to recede. Simultaneously, upward surging subterranean water was choked off. As the floodwater drained off the continents, every continental basin was left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes. During the following centuries, some lakes breached their boundaries by either spilling over their rims or undercutting their banks. The rapid, catastrophic discharge of these lakes, much like the collapse of a large dam, carved canyons. Several centuries after the flood, two very large ancient lakes, Grand Lake and Hopi Lake, sitting on top of the high, rising Colorado Plateau, breached their boundaries and carved the Grand Canyon in just a few weeks. The massive canyon was not carved by the relatively small Colorado River over millions of years. That river is a consequence of the carving of the Grand Canyon.
Can the residual waters of Noah's flood account for the amazing natural beauty of the Grand Canyon? If Dr. Brown's theory is correct, then the Grand Canyon was carved only a few thousand years ago, and nearly every geology textbook needs to be rewritten.
One has only to look at the Earth's anomalies to see that the hydroplate theory provides a far better explanation of the Earth's present condition than the other more prevalent, well-propagated, but highly implausible theories.
Were key geological markers, like the Grand Canyon, formed over millions of years? Or did they come to be within the short time frame of Noah's flood? The hydroplate theory, which supports the story of Noah's flood, says it was the latter. If that is true, what better example of supernatural engineering could one ask for?
What is that? Well, it's a poetic description. The Hebrew scholars will tell us it's a poetic description of a physical reality. And we wouldn't have known about this 100 years ago because we didn't understand the deep ocean floor. It's an interesting story about what happened in the history of geological thought. And in the 1850s, a guy called Antonio Snyder Pellegrini, he actually was one of the first that looked at the jigsaw puzzle fit of North and South America with Europe and Africa. And he put it back together and said, well, what happened if the fountains of the Great Deep were molten material coming up in big volcanic eruptions that broke up the pre-flood supercontinent and pushed it apart?
So he was looking at this from Genesis paradigm.
Absolutely. He was thinking, the Bible describing all the waters to gather together in one place at the time of creation, so the land was in one place, and the fountains of the Great Deep represented a pre-flood pseudocontinent that was split apart by volcanism, by volcanic activity coming up through rifts and splitting it apart. And he was thinking of continental sprint, the pre-flood supercontinent breaking apart and the fragments sprinting across the surface of the Earth to open up the Atlantic Ocean and produce the configuration of continents that we had today. Now, his ideas weren't taken on board immediately. Even the idea of continental drift, slow and gradual, wasn't proposed in the conventional scientific community until the early 1900s. And for over 50 years, those who proposed the idea of continental drift, and they were thinking in terms of slow and gradual over millions of years because that was their paradigm of thinking, they were opposed and they were ostracized. And this is a good illustration of what can happen with a paradigm change. After the Second World War, governments released maps of the ocean floor that they had developed as part of their submarine warfare. And suddenly, the geologists discovered that there were these mountain chains in the middle of the ocean basins. And they started to explore it, and within 10 years, there was a total paradigm shift. Before, you were scorned if you believed in continental drift. Now it's the reigning paradigm. It's called plate tectonics. The reason it's called plate tectonics is because it's not just the continents that fractured, it was also the ocean floor. And today we have a mosaic of plates that make up the outer skin of the Earth, the crust. Some of those, like the Pacific Ocean floor, is one plate, and it's pushing against the North American plate. And where it slides past one another, it's along the San Andreas Fault in California, which produces earthquakes. Where it's colliding today with the South American continent, the ocean floor is being pushed down underneath, and of course it starts to melt, and so you get the volcanic eruptions in the Andes. You can actually trace the plate's boundaries with the earthquakes and the volcanoes. We talk about the Pacific Ring of Fire. And so the reason why this idea took off of plate tectonics was because it was a very powerful way of explaining the features that we have on the Earth's surface today, where you have volcanoes, where you have earthquakes, those sorts of issues.
And why you have that ridge at the bottom of the ocean.
Correct. Now, there's some things that the conventional plate tectonics model can't explain. And this takes us back to the flood, because as soon as you start to add in what Pellegrini was talking about, looking at the biblical view of Earth history, suddenly the model becomes more powerful and explaining more information. Now, let me step you through it. So we're saying that at the beginning of the flood, we're going to break open the ocean floor, the fountains of the great deep. So it's like the seam of a baseball. You know how you've got all the stitching on a baseball, or cracks? We're going to have 70,000 miles of volcanoes suddenly exploding, and molten material coming up that's going to raise the ocean floor. You're going to have the steam jets come out because of the release of fluids from inside the Earth. Those steam jets are going to take some of the ocean water and take it up into the atmosphere, where it's going to drop. And the Bible talks about the windows of heaven opening, and it was torrential rainfall for 40 days and 40 nights. So the picture, it does explain that imagery that's described in the Bible. But it does more than that, because one of the things that the conventional model doesn't come to grips with is that the fossils, many of the fossils are marine creatures, and they're found buried up on the continents. And so you've got to have a mechanism from taking creatures from the ocean floor and burying them up on the continents in rock.
The hydroplate theory is when the fountains of the deep broke open in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11.
In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened.
The hydroplate theory also explains the breaking of the continents and the formation of mountains and canyons, and it explains why we have asteroids and why we find water on meteors. But the most interesting aspect about the hydroplate theory is how it explains the Ice Age. Now let's turn our attention to the Ice Age and see how it works biblically and scientifically.
Well, we're in the Mount Baker ski area, near Mount Baker, with Mount Shuckson in the background over here, with this beautiful glacier on the top of it.
It's absolutely gorgeous. You don't see glaciers very often. They're kind of a unique thing, aren't they?
Well, you have to get up in the high mountains today in order to be able to see them, and they're much smaller than they used to be. Glaciers used to be much larger than this.
How big? Are we talking about just twice that size? Or?
In the past, glaciers have covered these mountains down even 3,000 feet lower than we have today. But even before that, ice sheets, which are basically glaciers on flat terrain, covered major areas of the world. For example, in North America, the ice sheets extended clear across Canada. They extended down into the United States. So that period of time when that much ice was here, that was the Ice Age.
Well, I think most people probably think if you just lower the temperature, you can get an ice age.
Well, it doesn't work that way, because you got to get the water vapor from somewhere in order to produce the snow. So somewhere you have to have warm temperatures and you have to have cold temperatures. And we believe that's what happened during the Ice Age, that in the past that the oceans were much warmer and the continents were much colder, so that when water vapor that was evaporated out of the ocean was drifted over the cold continents, it then fell out as snow and ice.
As an atmospheric scientist, what do you see in the past that would have caused those unique conditions?
From my perspective, the Bible really gives us a clue as to what happened that caused the Ice Age. The Genesis flood was a magnificent, catastrophic, high-energy event, and it left the oceans warm. And it took about 1,000 years for the ocean to cool back down to the temperature that we have today, where it's uniform. But during that period of time, particularly right after the Genesis flood, when the oceans were the warmest, it produced a tremendous amount of heat and evaporated water into the atmosphere, which then fell as the snow and the ice on the continents, forming the Ice Age. So the Genesis flood was actually the cause of the Ice Age.
Larry, that sounds like we have some very, very unique conditions then.
Yes, they were. For example, we know that there were a lot of activity in the ocean. The plates that we are aware of on the surface of the Earth today, between those plates there were cracks where magma came up, hot magma from the mantle, spewed out on the bottom of the oceans and formed a gigantic mountain chain. And that 40,000-mile long mountain chain of hot magma, as it cooled, warmed up the ocean. And we have that information from estimates of sea surface temperature from seafloor sediment data. And the conventional community believes that as well. It's just they have a different...
After the global flood, there was an ice age. And when the fountains of the deep broke open, which is the hydroplate theory, this is when the Earth split apart, becoming what we see today. The water came back down and froze, becoming the Ice Age. So after the flood, there would have been the Ice Age. Breaking the global flood down to its basics, essentially it was a mass extinction event of both humans and animals. After all, the scriptures repeat this over and over again.
And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. And God said unto Noah, The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. And behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth, to destroy all flesh wherein is the breath of life from under heaven. And everything that is in the earth shall die. For yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And every living substance that I have made will I destroy from off the face of the earth. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of beast, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. And every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land, died.
The global flood was a mass extinction event of both animals and humans, and the Ice Age was an event that happened after the global flood. These are two key worldwide phases that can be used to determine the age of the Earth.
Let's now review the main events in the Genesis record in light of the topics we've covered in the hydroplate theory. The flood begins on the 17th of the second month of Noah's 600th year, with the catastrophic rupture of Earth's granitic shell. Deep interconnected chambers of water burst out as great fountains from the deep. Heavy rain falls from the fountains for 40 straight days, then suddenly stops even though the waters continue rising. In the early stages after the rupture, some regions of Earth are buried in supercold hail and muck, trapping, freezing, and preserving mammoths and many other plants and animals. At the same time, Earth's hydroplates are fluttering from the powerful horizontal flow of the ocean of escaping water below. The resulting pressure waves in the granite's quartz produces huge voltages which arc within, producing focused nuclear fusion and fission events, which birth Earth's heavy radioactive elements. The chaotic environment filled with many high-speed subatomic particles bombard the new, fragile heavy nuclei, greatly accelerating their decay rates. The heat generated greatly accelerates the flow of the escaping fountains. Some materials swept up in the violent hypersonic flow of the pulsing fountains are accelerated to such high speeds that they escape Earth's gravitation. An ocean of water, rocks, minerals, gases, dust, and organic remnants are blasted from Earth into the solar system, eventually becoming what are now observed as comets, asteroids, meteoroids, and trans-Neptunian objects. Floodwaters continue to rise even though the rains have stopped, as subterranean waters continue to escape from below. Plants and animals are buried in the muddy waters and eroded sediments. Repeated liquefaction of sediments produces stratified layers in which buried animals and plants are sorted into a sequence that some today mistakenly claim was produced by millions of years of evolution. After about 150 days, the hydroplate's perimeters have been eroded hundreds of miles and have thinned, forming continental shelves and slopes. The mantle floor can no longer support the imbalance from the missing material and bulges up, producing the mid-oceanic ridge. Rapid continental drift begins as plates slide away from the rising mantle floor. Soon the plates crash into the mantle floor as they run out of the lubricating water below. The compression event crushed and thickened the hydroplates and formed mountain chains. As that land thickened and rose, the floodwaters drained into very deep ocean basins. Much of the world's buried plant life is compressed and heated, forming many coal and oil deposits. The big roll of Earth's surface begins. After 150 days, the ark comes to rest on a newly formed mountain rising out of the waters. Meanwhile, the rising Atlantic seafloor causes shearing far below, and Earth's core begins melting and contracting as it extrudes toward the rising Atlantic. The Pacific hydroplate on the opposite side of Earth is pulled deep down under miles of rising magma, which is expanding up from the crossover density boundary. The Pacific seafloor is then covered in volcanic seamounts. A great wind is observed as the atmosphere adjusts to the subsiding Pacific plate, and ocean trenches are produced by the deformations. For centuries afterward, heat from the rising magma warms the oceans, greatly increasing evaporation rates. That, in combination with the newly formed continents yet to fully sink into the mantle, cause Earth's first and only ice age. 74 days after landing on Mount Ararat, surrounding mountains finally become visible. Noah begins sending birds out in regular 7-day intervals, observing their behavior. After 314 days since the flood, land is fully visible. Noah uncovers the ark. Apparently conditions are still too unstable to exit. Finally, 57 days later, after 371 days since the rupture, the land is dry and stable enough for all to exit the ark. Unbeknownst to Noah's family, the melting inner Earth is gradually increasing Earth's spin rate. The 360-day calendar they've used to chronologically track these events will soon be obsolete and confuse many generations of their offspring. As the newly formed mountains slowly settle into the mantle, frictional heating melts rock, generating magma. The magma is then injected under the adjacent crust, causing the weakest portions of the crust to fracture and rise to become plateaus. As the thickened continents sink into the mantle, the initially deep ocean floors rise to today's level in compensation for the downward flow of mass. Of course, sea levels rose with the ocean floors, and the continents were divided by water in the days of Peleg.
So, summary and conclusion. The hydroplate theory proves the global flood, and the global flood and the hydroplate theory proves the Ice Age and a mass extinction event, followed by the Stone Age and human development, which all can prove the age of the earth, beginning from Noah to us today, depending on how old you believe the earth is. With all of that being said, choose whichever model best fits for your world view. With that being said, have a blessed day and shalom.